There is a particular kind of quiet that falls over a man when he stops being afraid and starts being dangerous. Most people never notice the transition. That is the point. The fear and the danger look exactly the same from the outside. A calm face, a steady voice, a man who doesn't raise his hand or his volume. The difference is entirely internal. Fear is waiting for something to happen. Danger is knowing exactly what is already in motion. I want to tell you about the afternoon my wife slid a folder across our kitchen table and told me to keep my pension. My name is Gerald Sumner. I am 61 years old. I live in Hartford, Connecticut, and I have lived here for 34 years, which is longer than most of the oak trees on my street have been fully grown. I am a retired systems engineer. That is what my neighbors know. That is what my barber knows. And until approximately 11 weeks ago, that is what my wife of 26 years believed with complete confidence. I drive a 2014 Subaru Outback, dark green, with 118,000 miles on it, and a crack in the passenger side mirror that I have been meaning to fix since the spring of 2021. I did not fix it. I like it, actually. It reminds me that I am a man who does not fix things just because other people think he should. I want to give you some context before we get into what happened, because context is the difference between a story and a lesson, and I am interested in the lesson. Welcome to Dad's Raw Revenge. Get comfortable, because this one is going to take you somewhere. Drop a comment, and let me know where you're watching from. Hit that like button, and make sure you're subscribed. Trust me, you're going to love it here. I met Diane in 1996 at a project management conference in Boston. She was presenting on cross-functional team alignment, which sounds exactly as dry as it was, but she presented it with this precise, controlled energy that I found, I will be honest, impressive. She knew what she was talking about. She was organized in a way that I recognized, because I was organized in the same way. We were married 14 months later, in October of 1997, at a small ceremony in Hartford with 41 people in attendance. I remember the number because I paid the catering invoice, and the invoice listed 41 place settings. For a long time, it was a good marriage. I want to be fair about that, because fair matters more than dramatic. Diane and I built a life together. We raised 2 sons, Marcus, who is now 31 and lives in Denver, and Patrick, who is 28 and works in logistics in Charlotte. We bought a house on Wethersfield Avenue in 2001. We drove to Vermont every October for 11 years to see the leaves. We had routines and rituals and a shared shorthand that comes from living inside the same 4 walls for a quarter century. None of that is nothing. But somewhere around 2016 or 2017, something shifted. Diane was promoted to Regional Director of Operations for her company, a mid-sized supply chain firm out of New Haven. And the shift in her professional standing produced a corresponding shift in how she moved through our home. It was gradual. It's always gradual with intelligent people. A comment here about my simple schedule. A tone there when she described what I did to her colleagues at dinner parties. She started referring to my engineering work in the past tense, even while I was still consulting. She never said anything overtly cruel. She was too smart for that. But the architecture of her contempt was very well constructed, and I am an engineer. I notice architecture. I want to be precise about my own interior here, because I think it matters. I was not a man who was devastated. I was a man who was watching. There is a difference. I had spent 30 years building systems, first in aerospace, then in defense contracting, then in 3 private ventures that I had structured with considerable legal care and zero public profile. I understood that the most important variable in any system is the one the other party doesn't know exists. I had not told Diane about those ventures. Not out of deception, not initially. It had started as professional compartmentalization, the way any contractor keeps client relationships private. And then, as I began to understand who Diane was becoming, I made a decision not to update her. That decision was not emotional. It was structural. I made a pot of coffee every morning at 6:15. I drove Marcus to the airport when he moved to Denver. I went to Patrick's logistics company Christmas party in December of 2022 and ate the catered shrimp cocktail and talked to Patrick's manager about supply chain disruption. I drove home in my Outback, and I said nothing about the fact that I had spent the previous Thursday in a meeting with my attorney, Sandra Kowalski, a corporate and estate attorney on Farmington Avenue. 22 years of practice. The kind of woman who reads a financial document the way a surgeon reads a scan, slowly and without expression. Sandra had been organizing things. She had been organizing things for 4 years. The folder came on a Tuesday, February 11th, 2025. A Tuesday, which I mentioned because it struck me as a very organized choice. Not a Friday, where the weekend absorbs the shock. Not a Sunday, which carries its own emotional weight. A Tuesday, practical. Diane had always been practical. I came down to the kitchen at 6:15, as I always do. The coffee was already made, which was unusual. Diane rarely woke before 7. She was sitting at the table in her work clothes, which meant she had been up for some time. There was a folder in front of her and a second coffee mug, already poured, sitting on my side of the table. The mug was a gesture. I understood that. She had made coffee for me. She was being civilized. I sat down. She slid the folder across the table without saying anything first, which told me she had rehearsed this and decided that leading with words created too much surface area for negotiation. The folder contained a separation agreement. 14 pages, printed cleanly, already tabbed at the signature lines with those small adhesive arrow stickers. Yellow ones. She had tabbed it herself, I could tell, because the tabs were placed with the kind of precision that is slightly too deliberate. She had done this the night before, probably after I went to bed. She said, I want a divorce, Gerald. I want to be clean, and I want it to be fast. Keep your pension. Keep the Outback. I'm not interested in making this complicated. Then she laughed. It was a short laugh, barely a sound, more of an exhale through the nose. But it was a laugh, the specific kind of laugh that means, this is already settled in my mind, and your response is a formality. I looked at the folder. I looked at her. I picked up my coffee. I said, smart thinking. She blinked. She had expected, I think, either protest or capitulation. Preferably capitulation, because that would have been faster. She had not expected 2 words delivered in the same tone I use when Patrick describes a routing optimization that I had already considered and dismissed. Smart thinking. Delivered flat with nothing behind it. I said, I'll have Sandra look this over. She said, who's Sandra? I said, my attorney. She's been handling some things for me. It shouldn't take long. Diane's expression did something interesting then, a very small recalibration, the kind you only catch if you're watching for it. She had not known I had an attorney. She had assumed, I understood, that I would retain one after this conversation. The fact that I already had one, that there was already a Sandra, already handling things, introduced a variable she had not accounted for. But she recovered quickly, because she is smart and she recovers quickly. She said, fine, have her call my attorney's office. His name is Douglas Price. I said, I know the name. I did know the name. Douglas Price was a Hartford family law attorney with a strong reputation for aggressive asset division. Diane had retained him in advance, which meant she had been planning this for at least several weeks, possibly longer. This was not impulsive. She had done the research, made the selection, and paid the retainer before she sat down at this table. She had been thorough. I finished my coffee. I rinsed my mug. I got my jacket and my keys. I said, I'll be in touch. I drove to the office supply store on New Britain Avenue, bought a second copy of a document binder I keep at Sandra's office, and drove home. Then I sat in my Outback in the driveway for 14 minutes. Not because I was upset. I want to be clear about that. I was not crying. I was not spiraling. I was doing what I always do when a system shifts into a new operational phase. I was running the variables. 26 years. 2 sons. A house on Wethersfield Avenue with a mortgage that had been paid off since 2019. And Diane, the regional director, who had looked at the sum total of our shared life and decided the pension was the part worth taking. Something in me went very still. Not anger, not grief, not yet. Grief would come later, in a different room, in its own time. This was something older and colder. The specific kind of still that I recognized from the years I spent working on systems where a single misaligned component could produce cascading failure. The stillness of a man who sees a whole board and understands that the game has already been decided. not by the papers on the table, by the 4 years of quiet preparation that had preceded them. I called Sandra at 7:42 that evening. She picked up on the second ring, which told me she had been expecting the call. I said, "She filed." Sandra said, "I know. Douglas Price's office faxed us a courtesy notice this afternoon at 2:17. I sat with that for a moment. I said, "How long until we're ready?" She said, "We've been ready since November. If you have been listening for a while, do us one quick favor. Subscribe. A lot of people watch without ever doing it, but it costs you nothing and it means everything to us. Hit the like button while you're at it and drop your thoughts in the comments. I want to tell you about Sandra Kowalski because she is central to this story and she deserves a proper introduction. Sandra Kowalski, JD, is 57 years old. She has been practicing corporate and estate law in Hartford for 22 years. She is a small woman, 5'3" on a good day. She has said, with reading glasses she keeps on a beaded chain around her neck and a habit of tapping her pen against a legal pad exactly 3 times before she begins speaking, which I have clocked across dozens of meetings, and which I have come to understand means she has already reached her conclusion and is about to tell you what it is. She is originally from Scranton, Pennsylvania. She has a daughter at UConn and a rescue greyhound named Franklin. I retained Sandra in March of 2021. Not because I anticipated a divorce, not explicitly, but because I had 3 operating companies that had grown to scale where informal management was no longer prudent, and I needed an attorney who could hold complexity without simplifying it. Sandra was referred to me by a colleague in the defense contracting world who described her as the kind of lawyer who reads every page. In 22 years, I have found that description to be completely accurate. Let me tell you about the 3 companies, because this is a part of the story that requires some patience and some context, and I am asking you to stay with me here, because the context is the whole thing. The first company is called Sumner Technical Consulting, LLC. I incorporated it in Delaware in 2009, when I was still working full-time as a defense contractor. It started as a side vehicle, a way to take on independent consulting projects and systems integration without running them through my employer. Over time, as my employer wound down at Hartford office and I transitioned out, Sumner Technical became the primary vehicle for my consulting work. By 2019, it was generating approximately $380,000 annually in contract revenue, primarily from 2 long-term government clients. It employed 3 people. Myself as managing partner, a contract administrator named Helen Chu, and a part-time technical reviewer named Bob Fitch, who I have worked with since 2003. Diane knew Sumner Technical existed. She knew in the way a spouse knows about a side business. She knew the name. She knew I worked from a small office on Asylum Street. She knew it produced some income. What she did not know was a revenue figure, because I had never told her and she had never asked. In 26 years of marriage, Diane had never asked me a specific question about my business income. This is relevant. The second company is called Northfield Property Holdings, LLC. I formed it in 2013 in partnership with 2 colleagues, Ray Desmond, a retired civil engineer from West Hartford, and Tom Elliott, a commercial real estate attorney from Simsbury. Northfield owns 4 commercial properties in the greater Hartford area, a light industrial building in East Hartford, a small office park in Glastonbury, a mixed-use property in New Britain, and a retail strip in Wethersfield. My ownership stake in Northfield is 41%. In 2024, the portfolio generated approximately $1.1 million in net operating income, of which my share was $451,000. Diane did not know Northfield existed. I had formed it 16 months after an incident I will describe shortly, and I had done so deliberately with Sandra's guidance, under a structure that was entirely legal, entirely disclosed in my personal tax filings, which Diane did not review, because we filed separately, which had been her preference since 2012, because she found joint filing administratively inconvenient. Her words. The third company is called Arcline Systems Group, Incorporated. I incorporated Arcline in 2017 in Connecticut. Arcline is a defense technology advisory firm. It provides systems architecture consulting to mid-tier defense contractors who need specialized expertise, but cannot justify full-time senior staff. I am the sole owner. Arcline has 2 full-time employees and 3 part-time advisors, all retired engineers from the defense sector. In 2024, Arcline's gross revenue was $2.3 million. Net, after payroll and overhead, was $1.1 million, of which I drew a salary of $340,000 and retained the remainder in the company. Sandra had been managing the structural documentation on all 3 entities since 2021, the operating agreements, the board resolutions, the capital accounts, the intercompany relationships. She had organized everything with the same thoroughness she applies to everything, which is to say she had organized it the way a surgeon prepares an operating theater. Nothing out of place, nothing improvised, nothing that could become a problem under examination. In November 2024, we had completed what Sandra called the final documentation pass. Every entity was clean. Every capital account was reconciled. Every historical filing was in order. The asset schedule, the single document that itemized my full financial position across all 3 companies, the property portfolio, and my personal accounts, was 63 pages long and had been reviewed by Sandra 3 times and by a forensic accountant named James Prater, CPA, CFE out of Avon once. James Prater, 44 years old, former IRS examiner, currently one of approximately 12 certified fraud examiners in the state of Connecticut, which is relevant not because there was any fraud. There was none. Everything was legal and properly disclosed. But because James's background means he approaches financial documents the way a fraud examiner would, which means he looks for anything that could be used to mischaracterize a legitimate structure. He had found nothing to worry about. He told me, in his measured way, that the documentation was very clean. Coming from a former IRS examiner, I understood that as high praise. Now I want to tell you about the incident in 2013, because it is the beginning of the real story, and I have been patient enough getting here. In the summer of 2013, Diane's company went through an acquisition. The acquiring company restructured the regional leadership and initially indicated that Diane's position was at risk. For approximately 6 weeks, in July and August of that year, she believed she might be laid off. She was frightened. She handled fear the way many high-achieving people handle it, by converting it into control over the nearest available variable. The nearest available variable was our household finances. She came to me in August of 2013 on a Sunday afternoon and told me she thought we should restructure our financial arrangement. She suggested that she take primary control of the household accounts, consolidate the joint accounts under her name, move the investment portfolio to a brokerage under her management, and establish a formal household budget that I would draw from for personal expenses. She framed it as getting organized. She said it in the same tone she used for project presentations, calm, rational, pre-decided. I said, "Why?" She said, "Because I'm better at this than you are." She was not better at it than I was. We both knew she was not better at it than I was. But I understood what she was actually saying, which was that she was frightened and she needed to feel like she was holding something. So I agreed. I let her consolidate the joint accounts. I let her take the investment portfolio. And then quietly, over the following 3 months, I formed Northfield Property Holdings. I want to be clear. I did not form Northfield to hide assets. Everything was disclosed in my personal tax filings, as required by law. I formed Northfield because I had watched my wife, in a moment of fear, reach for financial control as a reflex, not as malice, but as a reflex, and I understood that this reflex would not disappear when the fear passed. It would become a habit. And a man who has spent 30 years building systems understands that you do not wait for a system to fail before you design the redundancy. The acquisition resolved. Diane kept her job. She was eventually promoted. The fear passed and the reflex remained embedded now in the architecture of our household finances. And I let it remain there because it cost me very little, and it told me something important every single day about the kind of partnership we actually had. By 2021, when I retained Sandra, I had been watching for 8 years. I was not angry. I want to be precise about that. Anger is an accelerant. It makes you move fast, and it makes you move sloppy. What I had was something slower and colder and more useful than anger. I had clarity. I had 30 years of engineering instinct applied to a very simple problem. What does this system actually look like? And what happens when it changes state? It changed state on February 11th, 2025 at 6:15 in the morning when Diane slid a 14-page separation agreement across our kitchen table and told me to keep my pension. The pension. A Connecticut state teacher's retirement benefit that I had accrued during a 4-year period in the 1990s when I taught engineering courses part-time at community college, while my defense contracting career was getting established. The current projected value of that pension, at my expected retirement age, was approximately $187,000 in total lifetime distributions. It was the smallest financial instrument I owned by a factor of roughly 47. She had told me to keep my pension. Douglas Price's office called Sandra on Thursday, February 13th, at 9:11 in the morning. Sandra told me about it that evening when I stopped by her office on Farmington Avenue on my way back from a meeting in Glastonbury. She had the call notes written on her legal pad in her precise, compact handwriting. She slid the pad across her desk and watched me read it while she removed her glasses and polished it with the cloth she keeps in her desk drawer. The call had been brief and collegial. The way calls between attorneys are when both parties believe they understand the shape of the situation. Douglas Price's paralegal, a woman named Claire, had called to introduce the case and request a standard financial disclosure timeline. Sandra had agreed to a 30-day initial disclosure window, which was routine. Claire had thanked her and ended the call. Sandra looked at me. She said, "They think this is a pension and a house." I said, "Yes." She said, "How long do you want to let them think that?" I looked at the legal pad. I thought about Diane at the kitchen table at 6:15 in the morning. Coffee already made, folder already tabbed, expression already settled into the calm of a woman who believed the outcome is decided. I said, 30 days. Sandra tapped her pen against the legal pad 3 times. She said, "I'll have the asset schedule formatted for production by the 14th of March. The 30 days were quiet days. I went to my office on Asylum Street every morning at 8:30. I had coffee with Helen Chu, who manages contracts for Sumner Technical and who has worked with me for 11 years and who knew nothing about the divorce proceedings, because I do not mix things. I worked on 2 active consulting proposals. I drove home in the evening, made dinner. I cooked. Diana had moved to her sister's house in West Hartford 2 days after the kitchen table conversation, and I sat at the table after dinner and looked at the window the way I have done since I was a young man, when I am processing something I am not yet ready to fully feel. I want to be honest with you about something. There's a version of the story where I tell you I felt nothing, where the divorce was purely tactical, and I had excised emotional content with the same precision I applied to everything else. That version would be cleaner, and it would be a lie. 26 years is a long time. Diane and I had been people to each other, genuinely, for a significant portion of those years. I had driven her to the hospital when she had her appendix out in 2008. She had sat with me through 3 nights when my father was dying in 2015. We had driven to Vermont every October for 11 years to see the leaves. I gave myself those 30 days. Every night after dinner, I sat at the table, and I let myself feel what I felt for exactly as long as it needed to feel. I did not perform stoicism, and I did not indulge collapse. I just sat there, with a cup of coffee that went cold most nights, and I let the grief be real, and then I let it pass, the way water moves through a properly designed drainage system. Not pooling, not backing up, just moving through. By the 14th of March, I was ready. Sandra called me at 9:03 that morning. She said, "It's done. 63 pages. I'm sending it over Price's office at noon." I said, "Send it certified." She said, "Already planned." I said, "And James's summary report?" She said, "Attached as Exhibit A." I drove to my office. I worked until 2 in the afternoon. Then I drove home and sat in my Outback in the driveway on Wethersfield Avenue for 11 minutes. Not 14 this time. 11. The math was simpler. Douglas Price called Sandra at 4:47 that afternoon. Sandra called me at 5:02. She said, "He asked if the asset schedule was complete." I said, "What did you tell him?" She said, "I told him it was comprehensive, current as of December 31st, 2024, and had been reviewed by a certified forensic accountant. There was a pause. She said, "Gerald, he was very quiet on the phone." I said, "I imagine he was." The 63-page asset schedule documented the following. My ownership position in Sumner Technical Consulting, valued at $1.2 million in business equity, based on a trailing 3-year revenue average and standard consulting firm multiples. My 41% stake in Northfield Property Holdings, valued at $2.87 million, based on an independent appraisal of the 4 properties conducted in November 2024 by Heartland Commercial Appraisals. Thomas Ritchie, M.A.I. C.M., the firm's senior appraiser, 40 years of practice, licensed in Connecticut and Massachusetts. My sole ownership of Arcline Systems Group, valued at $4.1 million based on a revenue multiple standard for defense advisory firms, cross-referenced against 2 comparable private transactions in the sector. My personal investment accounts, held at 2 separate brokerages, totaling $1.87 million. My interest in 2 real estate partnerships separate from Northfield, totaling an additional $440,000. The house on Weathersfield Avenue, appraised at $618,000, with no mortgage. Total documented net asset position, $11.1 million. The pension she had told me to keep, was listed on page 59, under a header that read, Additional Assets, Defined Benefit Instruments. Projected lifetime value, $187,000. It was the second smallest line item on the schedule. The smallest was a 2014 Subaru Outback, listed at $8,400. I want to tell you about the meeting, because the meeting is what the story has been building toward, and I have made you patient enough. The meeting was scheduled for March 28, 2025, at 10 o'clock in the morning at Douglas Price's office on Constitution Plaza in downtown Hartford. Sandra had suggested a neutral location. Price had offered his office. Sandra had accepted because the location did not matter, and the offer told us something. That Price was operating from the assumption of superior position, which is exactly the assumption you want the other party to carry into a room where you intend to restructure everything. I wore a navy button-down shirt, tan chinos, and my everyday shoes, the brown leather lace-ups I've owned since 2018 and resold once. I did not wear a suit. I am a man who wears a suit to funerals and depositions. This was neither. Sandra wore what Sandra always wears, a charcoal blazer, dark trousers, her reading glasses on their beaded chain. She carried a single document bag. Inside it was a printed copy of the 63-page asset schedule, James Prater's forensic summary report, and proposed settlement framework that she and I had developed over 3 separate evenings at her office in February, long before the kitchen table conversation, because Sandra does not prepare documents after events. She prepares them in anticipation of them. Diane was already in the conference room when we arrived. She was sitting on one side of the table with Douglas Price, a tall man, mid-50s, silver-haired, the practiced confidence of a man who had conducted many of these meetings and expected to conduct this one in the same way. There was a woman beside him I did not recognize. Sandra would later tell me she was a second attorney from Price's firm, brought in after the asset schedule had been received. Her name was Catherine Wells. She was the firm's corporate law partner. That detail is worth noting. Price had called in a corporate attorney. He had received the asset schedule and understood immediately that this was not a pension and a house. He had called Catherine Wells. This is the kind of detail that tells you the room before you sat down in it. We sat down. Price opened the meeting with the standard language, thanked everyone for being there, expressed hope for a productive process, noted that both parties had committed to a cooperative approach. He was smooth and professional, and I respected his professionalism even as I understood that every word of it was calibrated to manage a situation that had moved completely outside his original understanding of it. I said nothing. Sandra said, "Thank you, Douglas. We're happy to be here." Then Price said, "We've had the opportunity to review the asset schedule your office produced. We have some questions about the Northfield and Arcline entities in particular, specifically the formation dates and the disclosure history." Sandra said, "Of course." She opened her document bag and slid 3 packets across the table. One to Price, one to Catherine Wells, one to Diane. Each packet contained a condensed timeline of the entity's formation, the annual tax filings showing consistent disclosure on Gerald Sumner's personal returns, and a cover memo from James Prater summarizing his forensic review. She said, "All three entities have been properly disclosed on Mr. Sumner's personal tax returns in every applicable year. The formations are documented. The capital contributions are documented, and the revenue history is documented." James Prater's summary is on page 3. Catherine Wells was already reading. She reads quickly, I noticed. She had turned to page 3 before Price had finished opening his packet. Diane was looking at the cover page. I had not looked at Diane since we sat down. I looked at her now. She was reading the header on the cover memo. Her expression was the expression I had seen at the kitchen table when I mentioned Sanders' name. That very small recalibration. That micro-adjustment of a precise mind encountering a variable it had not modeled, but larger now, considerably larger. She looked up. She looked at me. I said nothing. She said, quietly, not to Price, not to Sandra, just in the room, "How long?" I said, "Northfield since 2013. Arcline since 2017. Sumner Technical since 2009. She said, 2013. I said, August. You had just restructured the household accounts. The room was very quiet. Price was looking at Catherine Wells. Catherine Wells was still reading. Sandra was looking at her legal pad. I was looking at Diane. Something crossed her face then that I had not expected, and that I want to describe accurately, because accuracy matters more than drama. It was not rage. It was not humiliation. Exactly. It was something closer to the specific grief of a precise person understanding that their precision had failed them, that they had looked at a system, assessed it confidently, and been entirely wrong about its architecture. I recognize that feeling because I had felt its cousin myself twice in my engineering career, and it is a very particular and very private kind of pain. I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. Price recovered first, because that is what attorneys are paid to do. He said, "Obviously, this changes the scope of our conversation significantly. I'd like to request a recess to consult with my client." Sandra said, "Of course." We stepped into the hallway. Sandra stood beside me and looked at her watch. I looked at the window at the end of the hall, which faced west, and the March light was coming through at an angle that made the downtown Hartford buildings look cleaner than they usually do. Sandra said, "They'll want to negotiate." I said, "I know." She said, "The proposed framework is reasonable. You gave more than you had to." I said, "I gave what was fair." She looked at me. I said, "Fair matters more than advantageous. I built those companies over 30 years. I'm not interested in settlement that requires me to spend the next 5 years in litigation protecting them. I want it done." Sandra tapped her pen against her palm 3 times. She said, "Then it'll be done." The recess lasted 31 minutes. When we returned to the conference room, Price presented 3 questions about the proposed settlement framework and 1 counterproposal regarding the Northfield property portfolio. Sandra addressed the questions with references to the documentation. The counterproposal was, in Sandra's judgment, within a range she and I had anticipated. She excused herself for 3 minutes to call me in the hallway and confirm, and I confirmed. We reached a preliminary settlement agreement at 1:17 in the afternoon. It took 47 minutes of substantive negotiation after the recess. The house on Wethersfield Avenue would be sold. Proceeds split evenly. Diane would receive a settlement payment of $1.4 million from the Northfield Partnership Equity, structured as a buyout over 18 months. The 3 operating companies, Sumner Technical, Arcline, and my personal investment accounts, remained entirely mine. The pension remained mine. The 2014 Subaru Outback remained mine. Diane signed a preliminary agreement at 1:43 in the afternoon. I watched her sign it. Her handwriting is very precise. She forms her letters with the specific care of someone who has taught cursive rigorously and has maintained the habit. I have always admired her handwriting. I admired it then. I signed at 1:46. We did not speak in the conference room after the signing. Price and Sandra exchanged the standard courtesies about next steps and document production timelines. Catherine Wells was already packing her bag. Diane stood, collected her copy of the preliminary agreement, and walked to the door. She stopped in the doorway. She turned. She said, "The pension." I said, "Yes." She said, "You let me say that." I said, "You said it." She looked at me for a moment. Something in her face was very still and very tired, and something else that I did not have a name for and did not try to name. Then she left. I walked to the elevator. Sandra walked beside me. The elevator doors opened, and we stepped in, and the doors closed, and Sandra looked at the floor numbers and said nothing, because Sandra has excellent professional instincts. I drove home on I-84 in my 2014 Subaru Outback with a cracked passenger side mirror. The March light was still good. I got home at 2:31 in the afternoon. I made a pot of coffee. I stood at the kitchen window and looked at the yard, the oak at the back corner that had been there since before we bought the house, the garden bed along the fence that I had rebuilt in 2019, the flagstone path I had laid myself in the summer of 2016. I drank the coffee while it was still hot, which was unusual for me. My phone rang at 3:14. It was Marcus calling from Denver. I had told Marcus and Patrick about the divorce in early March, without specifics, in the way you tell your adult children difficult news. Directly, briefly, and without making them choose a side. Marcus asked how I was doing. I said, "I'm doing fine. I'm standing in the kitchen looking at the oak tree." He said, "Dad, are you actually okay?" I thought about that for a moment. I said, "I'm going to be, yes. I think I've been getting ready for a while." There was a pause on the line. Marcus knows me well enough to understand what that means, and not ask the next question. He said, "Okay, call me if you need anything." I said, "I will. How's Denver?" He said, "Cold." I said, "It's March." He said, "It's always cold." I smiled, which felt like the right thing to do. It felt like a return to something. I drank the rest of my coffee and watched the oak tree and let the afternoon go quiet. That was 11 weeks ago. The house goes on the market next month. I have already found an apartment in West Hartford. 2nd floor, 2 bedrooms, a good window in the kitchen that faces east. The lease starts May 1st. I have driven by it 3 times in the Outback, and it feels right, which is not a scientific measure, but is the one I trust most. Sandra filed the final settlement paperwork on April 9th. The divorce will be finalized sometime in June. Give or take the court calendar. James Prater submitted his final accounting to both parties on April 14th. Everything is in order. Arcline Systems Group signed 2 new advisory contracts in March. Northfield is closing on a 5th property in East Hartford, a small warehouse that Ray Desmond identified in January, and that I agreed, after reviewing Tom Elliott analysis, was worth pursuing. Helen Chu at Sumner Technical has taken on a new contracts manager, a young woman named Sarah Park, who came with excellent references, and who I am told has already reorganized the filing system in a way that is, by Helen's assessment, almost annoyingly efficient. I take that as a good sign. I still make coffee at 6:15 in the morning. I still drive the Outback with the cracked passenger mirror. I have not fixed it. A man who has spent 30 years building things in quiet, who has learned that the most durable structures are the ones nobody sees until they're needed, does not suddenly need the world to see his work. The work was never for the world. It was for the mornings in the oak tree, and the particular satisfaction of a system that functions exactly as designed, long after the people who underestimated it have stopped looking. Patience is not passivity. I want to be clear about that, because I think it is the only thing worth saying at the end of this story. Patience is a decision to let a situation develop fully before you respond to it. It is a decision to understand a system before you modify it. It is 30 years of building things quietly, and an attorney who reads every page, and a 63-page asset schedule that was ready 4 months before anyone asked for it. Some men spend their whole lives being underestimated. A wise man learns to find that useful. She told me to keep my pension. I kept everything. 3 companies, 1 attorney, and a kitchen table where only one of us knew what had already been built. If you enjoyed this story, join our community by hitting that like button and subscribing for more real, raw, and family-centered stories. And as always, thank you for being a part of Dad's Raw Revenge. I will see you on the next one.